And welcome to Washington Unplugged. Bob Schieffer here. Well, President Obama's people told us that his report on how that bomber got aboard the American-bound airliner on Christmas Day would come warts and all, and it certainly did. When the president addressed the nation yesterday, we saw a very different presidential attitude, it seemed to me, and some very tough talk. But what happens now? We're going to talk with our national security consultant, Juan Zarate, who served in the Bush administration, and Charles Glass, author of Americans in Paris, who spent many years as a journalist in the Middle East, was once captured himself by extremists. Then we'll hear from the Washington Post's Anne Kornblut on the new book that she has written on Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential run. It is called Notes from the Glass Ceiling. But first, to President Obama on that withering report on what went wrong on Christmas Day. Charles Glass, Juan Zarate, it seemed to me that yesterday the president, in addition to sort of outlining what went wrong with his, with the intelligence and so forth and how this all came to happen, he was also answering his critics on the right. He used the phrase, "we are at war," which former Vice President Cheney, among others, has said he didn't think that he realized that. And he's also taking a little heat and some needles from the right today. I just picked up a copy of the New York Post, and it shows here, it says, a headline in dots, "They want to kill us." President finally connects the dots. Was this a different attitude, and does it reflect a different approach to terrorism, do you think, Juan?
Well, I think this is an epiphany, in a sense, not only for the administration, but also the American public, that we've got a global threat on our hands, that this wasn't just a vestige of the Bush administration, that this is current, it's adapting. And I think though the president has talked about a war on al-Qaeda before, in fairness, in not only public speeches, but also in legal briefs that the administration has submitted, this is a different episode. And it's an episode that has forced all of us to realize that we've got an adaptive enemy that is not only trying to use new techniques to blow up planes, but is also using a new venue, Yemen, to try to launch attacks against the homeland. And it's something that not only is about dealing with the past in terms of the Bush administration policies, but requires some new innovations in terms of security as well as in terms of our policies.
Charles, you've been dealing with extremists. You were out in the Middle East most of your career at ABC and at other places where you worked. You were once captured by Hezbollah. It is different, isn't it? I mean, when we're dealing with these kinds of groups and these extremists, basically religious extremists in many ways, is the United States heading in the right direction now, in your view?
Well, I remember something Margaret Thatcher said years ago when faced with the IRA in Britain, its bombing campaign in Britain, was criminals, criminals, criminals. She wasn't going to elevate them to a political status and treat them as combatants in a war, but just treat them as a criminal problem, which is basically why, in the end, a Good Friday Agreement was reached, because their political status had been denied them. And I think these people who are trying to blow up airplanes and assassinate people and so on are first and foremost criminals, and it may not be the best thing to elevate them to the status of warriors.
Then do you think the administration is going down the right line here in charging them in our courts? And basically, in that sense, they are treating them as criminals, while there are a lot of people who say they ought to be treated as military combatants, and we shouldn't be obligated to give them lawyers and all that sort of thing.
I think people who commit crimes or who are suspected of committing crimes are certainly entitled to a trial and should be treated like any other criminal, like any other common criminal. It's I hate to say it's the American way, and the Constitution requires it.
Why, do you take that view, Juan, or do you think these people ought to be brought before military tribunals?
No, with all due respect to Charles, and a deep respect for Charles' background and everything he's done in his new book, I do think we're in a different kind of battle, a different kind of war. And I agree wholly that we shouldn't elevate these folks. We shouldn't give them greater credence than they have. But the reality is that this is a global movement with cataclysmic intent that is literally in shooting wars and battles in theaters like Afghanistan, previously in Iraq and still in Iraq, and in places like Yemen. But they're also in urban environments. And so this is different than the terrorist groups of the past that we've seen in nationalist contexts, for example, the IRA in urban environments. And so I think we've had the laws of war, criminal laws. What we haven't innovated is this is something different. It's something in between and requires some creativity. So I think in the context of how we treat this suspect, Abdul Muttalib, I don't think it's inappropriate to say, is there a way to get as much intelligence from him as possible, legally, legitimately, and then throw him into the criminal legal process, the way we did with Jose Padilla. I don't think that's illegitimate, and I think there's a way of making that not only legal, but perhaps defending it internationally to make it feel legitimate and American.
How do we, I mean, there's no question, and I think everybody on all sides of this issue agrees, we're going to be at this for a long time. Where are we going? What kind of a world is it out there, Charles? You've been covering turmoil in the Middle East, which nobody has resolved that problem yet, and it's been going on maybe even longer than this one, or maybe this is all part of the same piece. But what can America still be the America that we've known when it's facing these kinds of threats out there?
I hope so. I would like it to be. I do know that my own experience in the Middle East has always been that whenever the United States sends troops to a country in the Middle East, it suddenly becomes very unsafe to be an American civilian there. And you're a target for kidnapping because you suddenly become the enemy. It can be counterproductive to send troops all around the Middle East.
I thought it was interesting yesterday when the president, emphasized we are at war, but he also emphasized we are not going to let others define the character of our country or how we go about our business. We're still going to do it as we Americans decide to do. That's going to be more difficult, clearly, and obviously more inconvenient. But I thought that was one of the more interesting things that he said yesterday.
I mean, he is a politician. A lot of this is simply to combat domestic criticism, and a lot of it's just public relations. I'd like to see what it actually leads to in terms of policy.
I think that's right, Bob, and I think you're right to focus on that. I think one of the things we've got to be careful of is not overreacting, and as Charles indicates, not playing into the hands of the narrative of the enemy. This is an enemy that talks about the West being at war with Islam. The troops in Muslim-majority countries actually adds and feeds to that narrative. And so we've got to find a balance of actually dealing with the threat without overly stoking that narrative and making it more true than it actually is.
I think another part of this is that this administration, the previous administration, the government seems to have grown so big that sometimes it seems like it just can't get out of its own way. We saw this in Katrina. Nobody can reach up and press the right buttons to get the government to function. We saw this, obviously, where our guard was down. There was a sort of bureaucratic complacency here. I think that leads to a lot of the loss of confidence that people feel in the government. It seems to me one of the problems and one of the things that the president is going to have to do to fight this war and to fight it effectively is to restore people's confidence in government, and that in fact government can do something.
Well, all of these reforms were meant to have come in after 9/11,
yes,
and they didn't work. Maybe there are just too many layers of the bureaucracy that still don't cooperate with one another. And as with 9/11, the information was there. If anyone had put it together, as I say, connected the dots, but no one did. And what I don't understand, and it really hasn't, and the fact that the president said the buck stops with him doesn't solve it, as far as I'm concerned. There is a real systemic problem, and this could happen again. There could be someone on a plane as I'm speaking that whose name is known, who's on several watch lists, but no one's put together the fact that he may be carrying a bomb.
I just quickly, I disagree slightly, because I think this is a different problem than what we saw prior to 9/11, where the information was actually stovepiped and was not allowed to be shared. Here you have a huge volume of information that actually was shared in the classic sense, but it wasn't put together. These bits and pieces weren't put together in the context of this growing strategic threat out of Yemen. That's where, to your point, there was a failure of actually prioritizing and having somebody in charge to say, this is a growing problem. Are we looking at the panoply of threats that are emerging out of Yemen that could pose a threat not only to Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but also directly to the U.S.? That didn't happen.
Whose job is it to do that analysis?
I will be honest with you, that to a certain extent comes out of the White House. When the White House sees a report, perhaps, that says there's a growing threat from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula directly to the homeland, that is an all-hands-on-deck moment to say, are we doing everything possible in the intelligence community, in the law enforcement community, in the homeland security community to find out what we can, to build up our defenses, to deter, maybe to disrupt. That's what the counterterrorism community actually did quite well, I thought, post 9/11. And we've had numerous successes in that regard. And so that, I think, was the grand revelation for me, at least, yesterday, that that wasn't an all-hands-on-deck moment, and that the White House didn't actually lead an effort directing different parts of the government to do this. And to your point, without somebody sort of saying, giving the orders and being in charge, it doesn't happen automatically.
Charles, before you go, I want to ask you a little bit about your book. I'm about halfway through it. It is a fascinating book, Americans in Paris, and it is basically about the Americans who stayed in Paris after the Germans came and occupied it in the beginning of World War II. About 5,000, I guess, some sort of famous names, artists, rather eccentric group of people, and also some real patriots and heroes. How did you come to do this? What made you decide to do it?
Because I was living in Paris and preoccupied with the problem of the German occupation, because there are monuments to the martyrs of the occupation all over Paris. And I kept wondering what I would do if I had been there at that time. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, I'm an American, and there must have been Americans here at that time. What did they do? And so I went to the archives and dug people up and found out.
It's a very interesting read, and I must say it's sort of new territory. I don't remember very much that's been written about.
No,
those
luckily it's the first one
who were there. So, well, congratulations on a fine book, and thank you for coming
with us
this morning. Thanks to both of you. We're going to turn now to campaign politics, and during the last presidential campaign cycle, two women, the presumptive Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton and Republican running mate Sarah Palin, took women to a whole different level in national politics. The Washington Post's White House correspondent Anne Kornblut covered both campaigns. She has written a book about it. It's The Glass Ceiling, which she says was only cracked during the 2008 campaign. So we want to talk to her a little bit about this book she's written. And Anne, do you think that Hillary Clinton, even though she didn't get the nomination, in a way did blaze some trails for women? And then we'll talk about Sarah Palin and what you think about her contribution.
Well, thanks so much for having me. The title of the book, actually, Notes from the Cracked Ceiling, is a reference to Hillary Clinton's departure speech in June of 2008, which everyone, of course, I'm sure you remember, and a lot of people thought was one of her best speeches of all. It's where she really talked for the first time about what it meant that she was a woman running for the presidency, that she'd had so many votes, and that it was so history-making. That was something she wasn't really comfortable discussing during the campaign itself, and in her final speech she did. There's a conventional wisdom out there that she certainly blazed a trail that will be easily followed now by many women. I dispute that a little bit. I'm a little skeptical of it, only because there aren't that many women in the pipeline. There aren't that many women who are sort of obviously about to run for president. Sarah Palin is one who might. There's some other women who perhaps in 2016 or maybe 2020 might, but there's no sort of obvious front runner among women the way there was leading into the 2008 campaign, and of course Hillary Clinton lost. So it's kind of a skeptical look at 2008. After living it, I decided to go relive it once more.
Do you think that Hillary Clinton was fairly treated? Would she have been given different treatment had she been a man?
It's so impossible to know if she would have been, because she is a woman. She was a former first lady. There are so many things that were unique about her. But when I looked at her experiences, added up some of the things that were said about her in the media, especially by commentators, reporters I think were by and large fairly fair to her, but a lot of dismissive remarks made about her, about the bags under her eyes, her cackle. And when I added them all up, I really thought, wow, it's worse than I had thought as I was watching the campaign itself unfold.
Let's talk a little bit about Sarah Palin, because she is obviously back in the news, has a best-selling book, got a big book advance. I myself do not believe that she will run for another office, but we'll all find out in due time whether I'm right about that or not. But I want to ask you this question, Anne. You know, it seemed to me that putting Sarah Palin on the ticket was a mistake that is made by old white men. And by that I mean, I think they saw her as someone who would appeal to the women who were disillusioned that Hillary Clinton didn't get the nomination on the Democratic side. And I think what they didn't understand was that it was not that she was going to appeal to those women, but who she appealed to were men. she was kind of this fantasy figure, maybe for old white guys. A shapely, attractive woman who hunts and fishes. It's like comparing it to the appeal of a man who cooks, and women love that. What do you think about that? What did you find out?
I think in my Palin chapter, I talk a little bit about the decision to put her on the ticket, and you're right, it was all men. There was not a single senior woman, and I'm not even sure Cindy McCain was involved in the decision to pick her. And if there had been a woman in the room, a female strategist, she might have raised her hand and said, hang on a second, guys. Well, first of all, women don't automatically switch parties because there's a woman on the ticket. Second of all, her beauty isn't necessarily going to be an asset. Some women do feel threatened by that. And third of all, we've got a lot of issues here with her family. She, of course, had talked about her daughter's pregnancy before they put her on the ticket, and that was well known. And they weren't prepared to handle that question when it came out. One of the most interesting things I found was that women voters are often the toughest when it comes to female candidates, and that they have to really be listened to. You can't presume they're going to support a woman. They have to be won over. And a lot of focus groups of other candidates, Jennifer Granholm, for example, female voters said, wait, she's too pretty to be governor, so they adjusted the ads. That kind of litmus testing was never done with Sarah Palin, that kind of road testing before they picked her, so I think you're exactly right.
Do you think that, what runs deeper in American society, sexism or racism, do you think?
I think it's impossible to measure. Certainly there's both, and both still exist. But one of the things, and I interviewed a lot of people on this question in the book, one of the things is that we have a kind of awareness of race that we don't of necessarily gender. And we've learned how to either spot racism or stop it or talk about it. President Obama obviously gave a big speech on race during the campaign. Still a lot to overcome, of course. When it comes to gender, I'm not sure we know where the line of what's appropriate and inappropriate is exactly. Not as much awareness of history either. So I think there's a difference there.
I thought you made a very interesting point at one point when you said that we all made a great to-do over Barack Obama being the first African American to win a caucus, which he won out there in a state that's nearly all white, Iowa. But you said nobody paid much attention, and we forgot that Hillary Clinton was the first woman who won a primary when she won in New Hampshire. And I must say, I had forgotten that.
And I had too, and I was there covering it. None of that, I went back and looked at all of the headlines, and of course, when Obama won in Iowa, it was a big deal. It changed the course of the race, but he wasn't the first African American to win a primary. And Hillary Clinton was the first woman to win a primary, and it made almost no headlines. All the stories the next day were Clinton stages a comeback. She had cried, she had choked up a couple of days before. It was all about her, unique to her, and not putting her in the larger context of women in politics.
Well, Anne, thank you very much, and it's a very interesting book and a really interesting take on a subject that we all know we don't know enough about, and we're all still learning about it. So thanks very much for being with us today, and thanks you for watching Washington Unplugged this Friday. Don't forget to tune in Sunday on television when we'll talk to Senator Dianne Feinstein, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, about all of the events of this past week. Have a good day. I'm Bob Schieffer.